The rain was a merciless drumbeat that night, pounding against the grimy windows of my loft in Philadelphia, a city I'd wrested a life from with nothing but my bare hands and a stubborn refusal to break. Its grey moods had become my mirror, its restless pulse a twin to the storm that churned inside me. My name is Lucas Grayson, a 38-year-old contractor who'd clawed his way up from the dirt. No trust funds, no gilded lineage, just grit, sweat, and a talent for building things. That endured. 9 years ago, I'd believed I'd constructed something unbreakable with Elena, my wife, my confidant, the woman who'd once been the axis of my world. That belief died the night she walked out, her stilettos striking the wet pavement. Like a hammer on an anvil, her voice slicing through the drizzle as she declared me insufficient. My steady but modest success, my quiet dreams of a simple, honest life. They were nothing to her, mere pebbles beneath the towering spires of wealth and prestige she hungered for. She'd vanished from my life without a backward glance, leaving me to pick up the shards of a future I'd thought was ours. I hadn't heard her name, hadn't caught a whisper of her existence since, until tonight. It came like a thief in the dark, a sleek black envelope slipped under my door, its edges sharp against the scarred hardwood floor. The paper was heavy, obscenely expensive, perfumed with a faint whiff of jasmine, her scent a phantom that clawed at memories I'd buried deep. Silver cursive sprawled across the front, Elena and Julian Ashford. I laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that bounced off the exposed brick walls of my loft, cutting through the rain's drone. Ashford. The name landed like a fist to the gut. Ashford, as in the dynasty that owned half of Philadelphia's skyline, whose lavish galas fueled tabloid headlines, whose contempt for men like me was as old as their fortune. Men who bore calluses from labor, not legacies from birthright. She'd done it, scaled the cliffs of the elite, traded me for a name that swung open doors I'd never even dare to touch. The invitation inside announced their engagement party, a grand affair at the Ashford estate set for this Saturday. I flung it onto my cluttered desk, where it settled among blueprints, pencil stubs, and a half-drunk bottle of bourbon. I poured a glass, the amber liquid glinting dully as I swirled it, my mind a tangle of bitter irony. Elena had always craved the untouchable, admiration, envy, a throne beyond my reach, and now she'd seized it. Good for her, I thought, the words sour on my tongue. I'd moved on, or so I'd convinced myself. Grayson Builds, my contracting firm, was a small but sturdy outfit, its reputation forged through relentless work and bids won against odds stacked high. I'd carved out a life she'd once sneered at, found a strange peace in the solitude of my loft and the rhythm of construction sites, let goof the need for her validation. So why did the sudden buzz of my phone, Marcus Tate's name flashing on the screen, an old client with a nose for opportunity, feel like fate sinking its teeth into me? "Lucas," his voice crackled through, slick with excitement. "You catch wind of that Ashford shindig this weekend?" I grunted, keeping my response vague. "It's not just a party, man, it's a damn treasure chest. Every big shot in Philly's gonna be there. CEOs, developers, the kind who sign contracts that can turn your life inside out. Rumor is there's our development deal on the table, millions in play, but it's locked tight behind an invite-only gate. And you, my friend, just scored the key." I glanced at the envelope again, its silver letters winking under the desk lamp like accolenge. A key, not to her glittering cage, but to the empire I'd been clawing toward all these years. Suddenly that invitation wasn't just a smug relic of her victory, it was a loaded weapon, and I held the trigger. I stood there, bourbon burning my throat, the rain a ceaseless roar outside as I stared at the envelope. For a fleeting moment, I pictured tearing it apart, letting the pieces scatter across the floor like the wreckage of our past. I had no business stepping back into Elena's orbit, no reason to unearth the ghosts of her betrayal and rip open scars I'd stitched shut with time and toil. But then the vision shifted. I saw myself striding into that room, past the curled lips and cold eyes of people who'd once dismissed me as nothing, proving I wasn't the hollowed-out husk she'd abandoned. I'd fought too long, built too much from the ruins she'd left to let her believe she'd erased me. My lips twisted into a smirk as I traced the embossed names with my finger, feeling the weight of her triumph and my defiance. She hadn't invited me out of sentiment. I was a loose end, a curiosity, perhaps a cruel jab to flaunt her conquest. Fine, I'd go. But I'd go as Lucas Grayson, the man who'd turned her rejection into the forge that tempered me, and I'd make damn sure she, and every last soul in that room, felt the heat of my return. Saturday broke cold and clear, the rain retreating, to leave Philadelphia sharp-edged and gleaming under a rare winter sun. I chose my armor with precision, a charcoal suit, tailored to fit the frame I'd hardened through years of labor, its lines clean and understated, yet cutting enough to demand attention. No ostentatious tie, no gaudy cufflinks, just presence, raw and unapologetic, the kind I'd earned through sweat and steel, not silver spoons. The suit was my banner, a quiet declaration that I'd built my worth from the ground up. The Ashford estate loomed on the city's outskirts like a citadel, a sprawling fortress of stone and glass, framed by iron gates that towered like silent guardians. I rolled up in my battered truck, a relic of my lean years, its dents and scratches, a roadmap of my rise, and handed the keys to a valet, a kid barely 20 who gaped at it like it was an alien artifact. I didn't blink, stepping onto the marble path with my chin high as music drifted out. A string quartet weaving through the murmur of wealth, the clink of crystal, the soft rustle of silk gowns and tailored coats. Chandeliers blazed overhead. As I crossed the threshold, their golden light fracturing across a sea of tuxedos, diamonds, and faces, polished by privilege. I drew a deep breath, steadying the pulse that hammered in my chest, and let a smile curl my lips, subtle, dangerous, a blade sheathed in shadow. I belonged here, whether they liked it or not. The grand hall engulfed me as I moved deeper, eyes tracking my every step like wolves circling prey. Some sparked with recognition. Contractors I'd outmaneuvered on gritty downtown builds, a city planner I'd impressed with a bridge redesign that had silenced doubters, others narrowed in confusion or outright scorn, their gazes scraping over me as if hunting for the flaw that explained my presence. Whispers trailed me like a wake. Who's that? Grayson, the builder. What's he doing here? I let them slide off me, snagging a flute of champagne from a passing tray, the cool glass grounding me against the tide of scrutiny. The room was a living tapestry of power, men with silver hair and sharper tongues, women in gowns that cost more than my yearly rent, all orbiting one another in a ballet of influence and ambition. I scanned the crowd, mapping the players, the developers with hungry eyes, the CEOs with practiced smiles, until my gaze snagged on her. Elena stood near the grand staircase, a vision sculpted from sapphire velvet, her blonde hair swept into an elegant twist that caught the chandelier's glow like a crown. She was laughing, her head tilted back in that effortless way I'd once found mesmerizing, her hand resting lightly on Julian Ashford's arm. He was the epitome of refinement, dark hair slicked back with precision, his smile a honed blade, his tuxedo whispering old money and unshakable control. They were a portrait of triumph, a flawless duo radiating power and privilege, the kind of couple that turned heads and silenced rooms, until her eyes crashed into mine. Her laugh choked off mid-breath, her lips parting as the color drained from her face, leaving her stark against the rich blue of her dress. For a split second her mask shattered. Shock widened her green eyes. Recognition flared like a struck match, and something raw, unguarded, flickered through them. A ghost of the woman I'd once known better than my own soul. Julian didn't. Notice still murmuring to a silver-haired man beside him, his voice a low hum of confidence. But Elena's fingers tightened around her champagne flute, her knuckles whitening as if it were her last tether to composure. I raised my glass in a slow, deliberate toast, locking eyes with her across the crowded expanse. She tried to recover, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges, but it was too late. I'd seen the crack in her perfect world. She'd built her fortress of wealth, moved on without a flicker of regret, but seeing me here, standing tall amid the ruins she'd left, hit her like a blow she hadn't braced for. I sipped my drink, letting her stew in that fracture, knowing the night had just sparked into something far more combustible than either of us had bargained for. I didn't rush to her like some desperate fool chasing a lost cause. I let the crowd sweep me along, moving through the sea of suits and gowns with the steady precision of a man who'd learned to navigate storms. I exchanged nods with men in bespoke tailoring, contractors I'd outbid on late-night deadlines, developers who'd once dismissed my firm as too small time, watching their smiles shift from perfunctory to genuine as they registered my name. Success had a way of rewriting the script. Weeks ago they'd have brushed past me without a glance, but now they lingered, offering firm handshakes and murmurs of solid work on that waterfront project. It was a bitter kind of validation, the kind that came too late to heal old wounds but sharp enough to fuel new fires. By the time I reached Elena, she'd patched herself together, barely. "Lucas," she purred, her voice smooth as silk but threaded with a razor's edge. "What a surprise. I didn't think you'd come." I tilted my head, taking a slow sip of champagne, letting the bubbles sting my tongue before I answered. "Didn't you invite me?" Her laugh was soft, brittle, a hairline crack in her poise. "I did, but I assumed you'd have better things to do than gate-crash my engagement party." "Oh, I wouldn't miss it," I said, my tone low, weighted, with intent. "Congrats, by the way, you've climbed higher than I ever dreamed." Her eyes flickered, searching mine for the barb she knew was buried in my words. Before she could parry, a voice cut through the tension. "Darling, aren't you going to introduce us?" Julian Ashford stepped forward, his smile tight but polished. To a mirror sheen, his hand extended like a king granting an audience to a peasant. I met his grip with my own, firm, unyielding, the kind forged from years of wrenching steel beams into place, not shuffling papers across mahogany desks. "Lucas Grayson," I said, holding his gaze steady, "and you must be Julian." He hesitated just a beat, his eyes flicking to Elena as if seeking a lifeline. "Her ex-husband," she added, her smile too sweet, too quick. A shield snapped into place with practiced ease. Julian's expression hardened for a fraction of a second before laughed, a smooth, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, the famous Lucas, I've heard stories." "Have you?" I raised an eyebrow, swirling my drink in a slow arc. "Only good ones, I hope," Elena cut in, her voice wavering just enough to betray her. "Of course, all in the past now." I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between us, the weight of our shared history pressing down like a storm cloud. "The past has a way of sticking around," I said, my eyes never leaving hers, each word a quiet blade. Julian laughed, again either oblivious or feigning it, his arm sliding around her waist in a subtle claim. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass with a flourish. I clinked mine against his, my stare locked on Elena, unyielding. "To old friends," I added, my voice smooth but heavy with meaning. Her fingers trembled as she lifted her, flute to her lips, the faintest tremor betraying the storm beneath her calm. I knew. She felt it. The undercurrent of everything we'd been, everything she'd discarded. Julian's grip tightened on her waist, a silent assertion of ownership. But her eyes stayed on me, caught in the gravity of a moment she couldn't escape. In that instant, I had her, not as a prize, but as a witness to the man she'd underestimated. The night unfolded like a chess match, every move calculated, every glance a gambit in a game I hadn't planned to play but couldn't resist. Worked the room with purpose, talking contracts with a grizzled developer named Henry Voss. No kin to Elena, just a twist of fate that made me smirk. He was old money, his eyes sharp as flint, and he'd taken note of my latest triumph, a waterfront rehab that had City Hall buzzing with rare praise. "You've got vision, Grayson," he said, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder, his voice rough with years of cigars and whiskey. "We need to talk. There's a deal on the table tonight, big stakes, bigger rewards. You in?" I nodded, my pulse kicking up a notch. This was why I'd come. Not for Elena's shadow, not for some petty revenge, but for the future I'd bled to build. Yet she lingered in my periphery, a specter I couldn't shake. Her laughter too loud, her glances too frequent, her presence a magnet pulling at the edges of my focus. I stepped onto the balcony for air, the city sprawling below in a mosaic of lights that pulsed like a living thing. The cold bit at my skin, grounding me against the heat of the room, and I let the champagne flute dangle from my fingers as I leaned against the railing. Footsteps followed, soft, hesitant, a rhythm I'd once known by heart. "You've made quite the splash," Elena said, her voice tight but measured, a thread of strain woven through it. I didn't turn, sipping my drink, letting the silence settle like dust. "Just doing what I do," I said finally, my tone even. She stepped closer, the jasmine scent hitting me like a fist to the chest, dragging me back to nights I'd fought to forget. "You always knew how to steal a room," she said, her words clipped. "I just didn't think you'd do it here." I faced her then, smirking, the edge of my glass catching the faint glow of the city. "You invited me, Elena. What did you expect?" Her gaze faltered, a crack in her armor. "I've heard things. Good things," she admitted, her voice softening. "You've built something." "From nothing," I said, letting the words slice. "No handouts, no Ashfords, just me." She exhaled, looking away, her profile sharp against the night. "You think I don't know who you are?" "I think you forgot," I shot back, my voice low, unyielding. "But you're remembering now, aren't you?" Her jaw tensed, but she didn't deny it, her silence a confession she couldn't voice. "I chose this," she said at last, her tone soft, almost pleading. "Julian, this life, it's what he wanted." I stepped closer, closing the distance until I could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, my voice dropping to a murmur. "Is it enough?" Her breath hitched, her gaze locking on mine, and for a moment the mask dissolved. Just Elena, the woman I'd loved, the woman who'd shattered me. Then Julian's voice cut through like a blade. "Elena, there you are." She flinched, stepping back as he appeared in the doorway, his smile cold, his hand reaching for her arm, with a possessiveness that made my blood simmer. "Grayson," he said, his tone clipped, his eyes narrowing. "Enjoying yourself?" "Immensely," I replied, smirking, letting the word hang like a dare. He pulled her away, his grip firm, but her fingers brushed mine as she passed, a fleeting electric touch that crackled with everything she couldn't say. Back inside, the air thickened with stakes I hadn't anticipated. Henry Voss pulled me aside near a towering floral arrangement, his voice low as he outlined the deal, a multi-million-dollar contract to redevelop an abandoned industrial district into a gleaming commercial hub. "You've got the edge, Lucas," he said, his eyes glinting with approval. "Your waterfront job showed guts and precision, exactly what this needs. But Julian's in the mix too, and he's pushing hard with Ashford money behind him." I glanced across the room. Julian stood amid a cluster of suits, his charm dialed to maximum, Elena at his side like a polished trophy. She caught my eye, her expression unreadable, but the tension between us was a live wire sparking across the distance. I worked the crowd, sealing my pitch with Voss, feeling the tide shift in my favor, years of grinding paying off in a single night. Then Julian cornered me near the bar, his shadow falling over me like a storm cloud. "You're making waves," he said, his voice low, dangerous, a predator sizing up a threat. "Good," I replied, meeting his stare. "That's the plan." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching. "Stay away from her." I smirked, leaning against the bar. "Worried, Ashford?" His eyes darkened, a flicker of something feral beneath. His Polish. "You're nothing to her." "Then why are you here?" I shot back, my voice calm but cutting. He stepped closer, his breath hot with barely contained rage. "She's mine." "Is she?" I leaned in, my tone lethal, each word a dagger. "She hesitated tonight, you saw it." His fists clenched, knuckles whitening, and for a heartbeat I thought he'd swing. Part of me wanted him to, craved the raw release of it. Instead, he stormed off, his retreat a victory I savored with a grin. The night reached its zenith when Elena found me again, alone on the terrace, the city's lights a distant hum below. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice breaking, raw with something she couldn't name. "Stirring everything up?" I turned to her, closing the distance until I could feel the heat of her breath, my hand brushing her cheek. "Tell me you don't feel it," I said, my voice rough, unguarded. She shivered, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears. "Lucas." Before she could finish, Julian burst through the door, his fury a living thing. "Enough!" he roared, grabbing her arm with a force that made her gasp. "We're leaving." She wrenched free, glaring at him, her voice trembling but steel-edged. "Let go." His shock was palpable, a crack in his armor, and in that fracture I saw it. She was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. The room fell silent as Elena stood, between us, her breath ragged, her body taut with a decision she couldn't unmake. "I can't do this," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, cutting through the hush like a blade. Julian's face twisted, a mask of disbelief and rage. "What are you saying?" he demanded, his tone sharp enough to draw blood. She turned to me, then back to him, her eyes burning with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "I thought this was enough. Your world, your name. It's not." I didn't move, didn't breathe as she stepped toward me, her hand finding mine, her fingers trembling but firm. "I was wrong," she whispered, the words a confession that broke something in me, anger, pain, the last vestiges of the man she'd left behind. Julian laughed, a bitter, broken sound that echoed through the stunned crowd. "You're throwing this away for him," he spat, his voice cracking. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "For me." He stormed out, shoving through. The crowd, the sea of onlookers parting as whispers erupted like wildfire. I pulled her close, her tears soaking into my shirt, her body shaking against mine, and I knew this wasn't just victory. It was redemption, not just for me but for her, a reclaiming of the woman she'd buried beneath layers of ambition and regret. The deal with Voss was mine by dawn, the contract signed in the quiet hours as the estate emptied. But holding Elena, feeling her choose herself over his gilded cage, was the real triumph. She'd walked away from me once, chasing a life she thought would fill the hollows I couldn't. But now she'd walked back, not to me, not fully, but to the truth she'd denied. Checkmate.